It's time to get rowdy with Rusty this week in wrestling on That Way Cool Wrestling Show Breakout.
Hello, it's time once again to get rowdy with Rusty on episode number 5. Hell, they haven't canceled us yet. On That Way Cool Wrestling Show Breakout, brought to you by the DJB Productions Network. Danny J pushing the buttons back at DJB Productions Network, getting us all up on the air because, hell, he knows I don't know how to do it. And I just do the content stuff. So without further ado, before you guys have to go to bed, let's go. We start this week with Season 2, Episode 3 of Dark Side of the Ring, the Brawl for All. Now, what the Brawl for All was this idea that the WWE, WWF at the time had in the 90s or 2000s, something like that, that the wrestlers would compete in a sort of tough man type boxing type contest and see who was the toughest. And it all started because JBL, John Bradshaw Layfield, one time said, if this shit was real, I would beat all y'all's goddamn asses and all that. So, long story short, Vince Russo went to Vince McMahon and said, we should let them fight for real. And so the show was good. It was, in some respects, better than the New Jack show last week, but still wasn't the best I think they could have done. And I'm going to go ahead and say this. This is my Come On Man award already. Come on, Vince Russo, man. One time he says from HannibalTV.com, oh, I didn't have anything to do with the Brawl for All. It was all Vince McMahon. And then in the Dark Side of the Ring this week, he says, oh, it was my idea. I'm the one that went to Vince McMahon and told it. So or pitched the idea. So I don't know whether Vince McMahon came up with it or whether Russo came up with it. But in other interviews as well from years past, long before I started doing this podcast, Vince Russo that it was his idea. So Vince Russo, you get my Come On Man award for this week. Come on, man. Learn how to tell the truth. Get it right or just shut the hell up. We switch over to AEW. No Ross or Excalibur Taz this week. Shivani and Jericho were on commentary. Boy, Jericho continues to show why he's great, not only in the ring, but he's one of the best damn mic workers in the business. The main things this week was Britt Baker versus Sheeta, and I know you guys usually don't like women's matches, and Danny J sitting back there at DJB saying, Rusty, 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 cut out the women's stuff. Well, Danny, just hang on a minute, Danny. Baker and Sheeta had a hell of a match in which Baker ended up with a bloody nose, a legit bloody nose. It wasn't the gig kind. Then they cut to a Jake skipping on into the show. They cut to a Jake Hager goes after Moxley next week in a no holds barred empty arena match. So they're still doing original content just with no fans in there. Hopefully that'll get back to fans pretty soon after the coronavirus stuff is over. Then there was a TNT Championship Tournament match between Shawn Spears, the former Ty Dillinger in WWE, and Cody in the main event. It was the greatest match on the show. Cody advances to next week. Good show, much better than last week. And as I said, Jericho was fabulous on the mic. I think they should throw away Excalibur and put Jericho on the mic permanently. I think their ratings would increase, but that's just my opinion. Switching over to NXT, WWE released a statement Friday that they have released the Revival, and the Revival have a 90-day compete clause. Everyone suspects that they will end up in AEW, especially since Matt Jackson, one of the executive vice presidents of AEW, said on Twitter this week, one day we will wrestle the Revival and all will rejoice. And then one of the Revival members said the same thing. And I know Marty Lundy, who is Arn Anderson in AEW, was an agent in WWEF, E at the time. And he's a big fan of the Revival. So after the 90 days no-compete clause is up, look for the Revival to show up in AEW. In other news, according to my buddy Mike Mooneyham from the Charleston Post and Courier newspaper in Charleston, South Carolina, The Rock and Ric Flair are working on a movie together that's financed by The Rock. If you will remember, The Rock also did the life story / biography of Paige, which was Wrestling with My Family. I'm not sure of the title yet for the Flair movie, but it should be out sometime next year. For those of you wondering, the XFL is dead. $300 million of Vinnie Mac stock down the tubes. I bet you Danny J could have more stock than that, but Danny J would spend his money more correctly than Vince did. $300 million wasted and 120 people laid off. So I'm sad for the layoffs, but the XFL really wasn't going anywhere, even if the coronavirus had not popped its ugly head. Those of you might not know, but the XFL was only getting their production cost paid. They weren't getting like TV right money like the WWE gets. So even if there was no coronavirus, I don't think it would have survived anyway. Switching over to, for some reason, I guess to get ratings, the WWE has sent Charlotte Flair down to NXT, and she has become the NXT Women's Champion. Lastly, on NXT, they finally had the blow-off match between Masahiro Ciampa and Johnny Gargano in an empty arena match. Gargano's wife comes in and tells Ciampa that she hates her husband, then kicks Gargano in the cojones for a supposed win, but then it's revealed that Gargano was wearing a cup. Then she kicks Ciampa in the balls for the win. Johnny Gargano and his wife leave the arena, and the show ends. Great match, all things considered, considering there was no fans there. Pro Wrestling Sheet has reported that at least one WWE talent and on-air talent, so I'm assuming that means a broadcaster, not a wrestler, has tested positive for the coronavirus, but they will be okay. According to WWE live programming returns next week. I don't agree with that, but I don't have enough time in this podcast to tell you why I don't agree with it. But my good friend Tim Brown would say, who's an avid viewer of the podcast, he would say, Vince McMahon will do anything to make $1. So, Tim, I think you're right on this one, buddy. Moving right along, those of you may remember the first episode of Dark Side of the Ring a few weeks ago was in relation to the Chris Benoit murders. And one of the things that came out through Nancy Benoit's sister, Sandra, she alleged that Kevin Sullivan and Nancy were abusive. And then the producers of the show popped up a graphic later in the show that said Kevin Sullivan was not available for comment or something to that effect. This week on episode 326 of the Jim Cornette podcast, Kevin Sullivan talked about his relationship with Nancy, his relationship with Chris Benoit before and after Chris took Nancy away, and so forth. And here are 6 quick points that I'd like to bring up. Number 1, Nancy and Kevin were having trouble about 6 months before she got into the relationship with Chris. Number 2, Kevin was head booker in WCW and made the decision to put the WCW title on Benoit. In fact, Kevin talks about the night that he took Benoit and Sid Vicious into the room, and had to convince Sid Vicious to do the job for Benoit. And Sid said, I trust you, and so I'll do it. And so Kevin was responsible for Benoit becoming WCW champion. And you guys know the rest of the story. Benoit, Guerrero, Dean Malenko, Perry Saturn, and someone else left for the WWF at the time. Number 3, Kevin was running a gym in Key West, Florida at the time. He's now in Seattle and has sold the gym. He was running the gym in Key West, Florida at the time of murders and was investigated and cleared by police. And the reason I bring it up is pretty much the same reason he brought that up, is because he said to this day that there are people that still believe that Kevin Sullivan had something to do with the murders of Benoit, because they don't want to believe that Benoit just snapped and killed Nancy and Daniel before killing himself. Sometimes that happens. People just snap for the wrong reasons. It's an unfortunate situation for everybody involved. Number 4, Nancy and Kevin were living in 2 different houses in 2 different parts of Florida when they divorced years ago. Number 5, Chris had major CTE evidence in his brain at the time of the tragedy, and that the fight in the Benoit match, in the fight in the sort of street fight kind of match between Kevin Sullivan and Chris Benoit, that Nancy's sister Sandra referred to was a shoot, was not a shoot. It was a work shoot. And it appears that Nancy's sister Sandra just bought it as a legitimate shoot. But Kevin Sullivan was not mad at Chris Benoit at the time that they had the match, even though Nancy and Chris were together at the time. The only supposed spousal abuse charges that were filed between Nancy and Kevin when Nancy and Kevin were living together was Nancy had allegedly stabbed Kevin in the chest. And so Kevin called the cops. Nancy was taken into custody and she went to jail. A day or 2 later, I forget the time frame, but a day or 2 later, Kevin Sullivan even paid for Nancy to get bailed out of jail. So Jim Cornette wanted him to be on the podcast to set the record straight. And when I heard the podcast this week, I thought you guys need to know those 6 points. And we'll see where that goes. Hopefully one day, maybe we can even get Jim Cornette here, and not only to talk about that, but anything else as well. I still haven't heard back from him, though. I'll continue to reach out. Switching over to Danny J's favorite product, MLW episode 105. Show opened with a video package showing Mexico and talking about Lucha Libre history and the legacy of the AAA promotion there in Mexico. Sometimes these days, many promotions call themselves pro wrestling, but they're really trying to copy the WWE and be sports entertainment. It was nice to see that MLW is doing what Danny said and trying to keep it as close to pro wrestling as possible. Moving on, MLW and the AAA Superstar Series from Tijuana, Mexico. And there was an in-ring flag ceremony followed by Mance Warner doing his redneck persona with WWE legend at the now AAA legend Savio Vega, talking about going to the pay window and then going out drinking. Savio and Warner versus Mortiz and Pagano, if I'm pronouncing that name correctly. Some of these Mexican names I can't get right. I apologize, and I don't mean to offend anyone. In a AAA style hardcore match, Mortiz and Pagano win after a burning table spot and many other great spots. It was really a good match. MLW management later said that King Mo was suspended for 1 month and fined $10,000 for his attack on the Killer Cross about a month ago. As you know, Killer Cross videos have now spotted up on NXT. and he will be coming to NXT and then moving on to WWE, I presume, in the near future. I don't anticipate that he'll spend much time in NXT. They continue to push on MLW that MJF is no longer there. You know that MJF is with AEW, so we won't spend a lot of time on that. Lastly, Alexander Hammerstein, who is a star. Watch out for this guy. He's a star in the making, and I wouldn't look for him to be in in MLW too long, because his star will rise. Alexander Hammerstein defended his MLW Cruiserweight Championship versus Laredo Kid. Hammerstone retains the title, but both men are stars, and look for nothing but the best from them and the rest of the MLW roster in the future. Lastly, almost lastly, we move over to the Dead brand, better known as Impact Wrestling. Tessa Blanchard and Eddie Edwards versus Ethan Page and Josh Alexander. Tessa loses her cool after the match because she did the job. She gets into an argument and then loses her cool and takes the fall. Tessa tells Eddie she knows that Eddie wants a world title match coming soon. Mike Elgin runs in. Yeah, the same Mike Elgin from New Japan Pro Wrestling, and before that he was Michael Elgin in Ring of Honor. Michael Elgin runs in and attacks Tessa after Edwards leaves for the rampway. They promote a pay-per-view called Rebellion, and it looks like at the Rebellion pay-per-view, Tessa will have at least one opponent in Eddie Edwards for the Impact World Championship. And you guys know how I feel about Tessa having the men's title. I still don't agree with it. And lastly, to end this up, just before we went to record this, I found this note. Ronda Rousey has been going around, most notably on the Steve O podcast and other places, but most notably on the Steve O podcast, talking about how the fans are ungrateful, and she doesn't know when she'll return to WWE, if she returns at all, and that she's tired of doing fake matches and blah, blah, blah. Well, I had to give my Come On Man award to Vince Russo because of his lies. But if I had a second Come On Man award, I'd give it to Ronda Rousey. I was a big fan of Ronda Rousey when she was in MMA, even after she lost her 2 MMA fights. But she's only been in the WWE for 16 months, according to her. And in that 16 months, she made millions of dollars, more money than even Danny J makes. So if you make more money than Danny J makes, don't criticize the fans, for God's sake, who bought your merchandise, you stupid. You know what? I can't cuss on this podcast because Danny J would throw me off. But if I could cuss, I'd call her the B word. But anyway, you stupid B, would you please shut your mouth? You made millions of dollars. So take your money and bow out gracefully. And if it wasn't for the fans, you or nobody else in WWE would have a pot to piss in or a window to throw it out of. So just shut the hell up. I feel better. Anyway, that's going to do it for me. Rusty Loudermilk, I'm out here. Thank you for joining us on the DJB Productions Network. Be sure to subscribe. Be sure to watch the other shows, not just the wrestling shows, but all the shows on the DJB Productions Network. Special thanks to Mark, Danny J, and everybody at DJB Productions. And we'll see you here next week with more wrestling news. Same time, same channel on that Way Cool Wrestling Show Breakout. And let's get rowdy with Rusty. Yeah!
Thank you for listening to that Way Cool Wrestling Show Breakout. We'll see you at the matches. Goodbye, everybody.